There's a version of teaching that feels very safe. You plan a lesson, you deliver a lesson, and you move through it predictably. All of your students follow along, they stay on track, and by the end of the period, you can point to what was covered and say, that worked. And to be clear, sometimes it does work, but that version of teaching depends on a very specific assumption. And that assumption is that learning is something that we can control. That if we organize information clearly enough and manage our time effectively, we can control learning. Let's say you're mid-lesson and everything is going according to plan, and then suddenly somebody drops a pencil box, sending dozens of tiny little items across the classroom floor underneath everybody's feet. Or conversely, you're halfway through explaining a new concept that isn't reaching the students in the way that you want it to, and somebody asks a question that, while it's technically related, it's not where you were going, and then you lose control of the room because other people start contributing in response to that original question, and the conversation keeps moving farther and farther away from what you intended it to, and you can feel the lesson slipping from your fingers. And in your head, you're thinking to yourself, okay, cute, love this, but we have somewhere to be. How many days until the provincial achievement tests? The problem with all of these assumptions is that learning is not a linear process. It is emergent. It doesn't come from what is presented, it comes from how ideas interact and how people interpret them and how prior knowledge collides with this brand new information. And this is how meaning gets constructed in real time. Which means that when things start to go off track, those actually might be the moments where something real is happening. And that can be uncomfortable because that means that the most important parts of learning are also the least controllable. So most of us in these moments pull it back. We say something like, let's stay focused. We'll come back to that later. Please everybody, don't stand up and help him pick up his pencils. One helper is fine. And sometimes that is the right call, but sometimes you shut down the most meaningful part of the entire lesson. Because most often what's happening in those tangential moments is not a distraction. It was very possibly a connection. It was people actively trying to make sense of new information in real time, and if it doesn't fit the structure, most of us cut it out. And the tension between the decision of whether to embrace something or to cut something out, that's what this episode is about. Today we are talking about tangents, not just as interruptions, but as opportunities. Because the question we need to ask ourselves as teachers is not, are we teaching a lesson, but rather, are we responding to learning as it is happening? Let's get into it. Detox starts now. Chapter 1, the co-construction of knowledge. So if we are going to take emergence seriously, we have to shift the way that we are thinking about teaching. Because right now, the dominant mode of delivery is the park and bark. You park at your desk, you bark at the students, I have knowledge, I present it, you receive it. Efficiency. But this model misses the fact that when you are teaching, we are interrupting systems that are already in motion. Learning science consistently shows that knowledge is constructed and not received, and that learning is built through interaction with new information and prior knowledge, and it is shaped by context, language, and social exchange, which means that no two people are learning the same thing at the same time, even if they're sitting right beside each other. Even right now, as I'm explaining this to you, what you are understanding is not what I am saying. Your brain is building on what it already knows, which is messy because when there's multiple people involved, that process becomes co-construction. It emerges through dialogue, through interpretation and clarification, through those moments where somebody says something slightly off and somebody else builds on it. And suddenly the idea starts to take shape in ways that weren't planned. And those off-track moments are direct evidence that learning is happening. A tangent is a visible trace of cognition happening in real time, and these responses are not random, even though sometimes they seem very random. They are evidence of how that student is organizing information in their minds in real time. So when students generate connections that seem unusual or off track, what we are seeing is the activation of their prior knowledge integrating with their new input. And these first iterations of thought are often incomplete because our brains are considering all of our prior knowledge, language, experience, partial understanding, and all of those different sources of information get pulled into this equation of trying to integrate new information. So it might feel like the idea presented by a student is not fully formed, and it might not even be accurate yet, but it is structured. It is going somewhere. And when you shut that down too quickly, what we are actually interrupting is the mechanism through which understanding was about to develop. And to be clear, structure does matter. We can't let every lesson dissolve into chaos because somebody had a thought about their hamster named Simon. But if we treat every deviation as something to correct, we're also limiting the same conditions under which deeper learning can come out. The problem is that emergent thinking is not very efficient, and it often produces those ideas that are half-baked before they become useful. So from a classroom management perspective, this feels very risky because it feels like you're losing control of your classroom or your lesson, but from a cognitive perspective, that weird connection is often the closest we get to watching learning really happen. To end this chapter, I want you to consider the question: how much of what we call good teaching is actually just good control? And if control is the goal, we are making a very specific trade-off. We are choosing structure over emergence, and I don't think that we talk about that trade-off enough. What might happen if we loosen our grip on that control? Just a little bit. Chapter 2, Feedback Loops in Action. So chapter 1 is about those moments where thinking starts to emerge, and now we're going to talk about what happens immediately thereafter. What actually drives the emergence over time? Because when ideas appear not completely formed, they stabilize through feedback from individuals and from systems. Every time somebody shares an idea or decides to not share an idea, that action is shaped by what has happened before and what they expect will happen next. And learning at its core is this continuous, often subconscious adjustment based off of the response from the individuals and the systems around them. And this is what we call a feedback loop. Output is generated, the environment responds, and then that response forms the next output. And over time, these patterns begin to stabilize, where certain types of thinking get reinforced and others get suppressed. So what we end up with is not just learning, but a filtered version of learning, which elevates classrooms from places where learning simply happens to systems that are actively shaping how learning happens. Now let's get back to the tangents. When somebody shares an idea as a response to connect with new information, that moment does not exist on its own because it gets responded to, and that response matters a lot more than we think. You've probably seen this play out in real time. Somebody shares something that is almost there, not quite accurate, but clearly doing something, and you have a decision to make. Do you correct it? Do you redirect it? Do you let it sit for a second and just see what happens? Most of the time, as teachers, we move quickly. We have deadlines. We're uncomfortable with the silence. But from the student's perspective, this moment is very potent data. It answers a question that human beings are constantly asking: what kind of thinking is allowed here? Research on feedback shows that it is one of the most powerful influences on student outcomes because it changes how students engage, what they pay attention to, and how willing they are to take risks. So when certain kinds of thinking are being constantly redirected, students adapt, and over time that adaptation compresses the range of thinking that we actually see in the classroom. Because students start offering ideas that are safer and closer to what they think is expected, more aligned to the structure of your lesson, and from the outside, this can look like an improvement, but what we're actually seeing is a narrowing because the system becomes more efficient, but less generative. The class will feel smoother because you have less interruptions, but it will also feel quieter in a very specific way because what's missing is the entire process. We're not seeing thinking in action anymore. We're just seeing the outcomes. So if a student shares something slightly off and it gets shut down quickly, the lesson that they pull from that is not that answer was incorrect. It's don't say that kind of thing again. It's another trade-off of accuracy now or understanding later, control now or emergence over time. And there's also a well-documented effect on feedback, especially when it is immediate and evaluative, can shift attention away from the task and towards performance itself, and that reduces the depth of thinking. So instead of engaging with ideas, students engage with how that idea might be judged. Ultimately, learning is about what we reinforce through feedback, and feedback is a delicate balancing act because every response we give is shaping the next attempt, and eventually it shapes whether there is an attempt at all. Chapter 3, Balancing Structure and Freedom. So at this point, we need to get into the practicality of it all because it's one thing to say that learning is emergent, but it is completely another thing to actually run a classroom where 30 people are doing 30 different things at once, and you're still somehow responsible for getting through the curriculum. So let's be clear about something. Structure is not the problem. Structure is what makes learning possible in the first place. It reduces uncertainty, it organizes our attention, it creates shared reference points that ideas can actually interact with. So without some level of structure, nothing stabilizes, and then you don't get any emergence, you just get noise. The key here is the difference between structure that supports thinking and structure that replaces thinking, because when that structure gets too tight, it starts doing the cognitive work for students. It tells them what matters, when it matters, and when to move on, which means that fewer decisions are being made by the learner, and learning is fundamentally a process of making sense of something, not just remembering it. And learning also depends on how that information is processed. When too much structure is imposed, especially in the form of step-by-step directions or tightly controlled pacing, it can reduce the need for learners to actively organize and integrate new information themselves. And sometimes this feels helpful, but it also means that the part of the brain that's responsible for building understanding is doing less work. So again, this whole episode is about tension. If you have too little structure, thinking doesn't cohere. Too much structure, and thinking doesn't happen. But the thing is, most classrooms do not sit in the middle of this continuum of too much structure and too little structure. Most classrooms lead hard into the control side because control is easily measurable. It keeps things moving, but emergence does not care about your pacing. It shows up when it shows up, and it rarely aligns with the exact moment that you need it. Those moments where something starts happening, and the room shifts, and ideas start bouncing off of one another, and the energy changes, all of those moments are decision points. Do you shut it down, or do you redirect it just enough to keep connected without shutting it down? That's the work right there. It's not eliminating the tangents, it's not fully surrendering to them, but learning how to read them in real time. And reading them is not done with a formula, it's a judgment call every single time. It is a form of expertise to know when to hold on to structure and when to loosen it, and how to shift in response to what students are doing without losing the coherence of a lesson. And the only way to develop this skill is to make mistakes in such a way to show you what you do not want to happen in your lessons. And do not get it twisted. What you are managing in those moments is not behavior, it's complexity. Too much complexity and the students will disengage because nothing makes sense. Too little complexity and students disengage because nothing is happening, it's boring. So you're constantly adjusting the level of challenge, the level of openness, the level of constraint, trying to keep the system in a place where thinking can actually occur. And this is why it feels very difficult to get it right, because There are no fixed points. The balance between structure and freedom is not something you achieve once and just maintain. It's something that you have to recalibrate continuously based off of the people that are in front of you, the moment that you're in, and the direction the thinking is starting to move in. So to truly support emergent learning, we have to ask ourselves, how do we build enough structure to support thinking without taking over the thinking itself? And the only way to answer that question is to stay in it, to watch closely, to respond carefully, and to accept the fact that the most important parts of teaching are the ones that you cannot fully plan for. Conclusion: improvisation as a pedagogical tool. So if we pull all of this together, what we've really been talking about here is responsiveness. Because if learning is emergent and it is shaped through interaction, feedback, and interpretation in real time, then teaching is not really about delivery. Please, no more park and barks. Teaching has to be adaptive. It has to be able to move with thinking as it develops, not in spite of it, but because of it. This is where nurturing emergent moments starts to look a little bit less like execution and a lot more like improv. And I mean improv as in working within a structure while staying responsive enough to what is actually happening. There still is a plan. There still are goals. There still are constraints, but the path between those 2 points is not fixed, and it will shift based off of the interaction between people, ideas, and the context, which is uncomfortable because it means giving up a certain kind of control, the kind where you know exactly how your lesson is going to unfold. The problem is that learning is not stable, it's dynamic, it's not linear, and it moves in ways that don't always make sense with the moment, and only become clear in hindsight. So, when we treat unpredictability as something to eliminate, we can't excuse that as managing behavior anymore. We are managing thinking, and unpredictability is a part of that process because they are the moments where thinking starts to organize itself in response to that new information. The key is to recognize when something is happening, to give it just enough space to develop, and to guide it back into something coherent without shutting it down. That's the balance. It's not structure or freedom, it's structure and freedom in constant negotiation. So the next time that a lesson goes off track for you, the question is not how to get it back, it's whether it was on track to begin with. Because if learning is emergent, then maybe the track was never the point. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.